Thank you, Ken Corla. I'm up here in the gods. Minister, I, like a lot of other deputies, have some real concerns about the proposed amendments. We are, as Deputy Stanton just told us, looking in fact at 4 amendments, 2 on health, 1 on emergency measures in the public interest, and 1 on criminal justice enforcement powers. Now, these amendments were put in place to deal with an emergency situation, and as the nature of the emergency has changed since we first put them in place, I think we have to take account of that when we are discussing these proposals. Up to now, Minister, I voted with the government in supporting this legislation and in rolling it over. I had concerns, but I did feel it was a measured response. But legislation like this, and I suppose any legislation, but especially emergency legislation that gives significant powers, unprecedented powers, to law enforcement, to medical officers, and indeed to you, Minister, to make specific regulations, has to be very closely examined. I think we would be failing in our duty as TDs if we did not do that. Now, as I said, I believe this legislation got the balance right last year and last January, but circumstances have changed considerably since then. In other words, we got the balance right, but the balance has shifted. And the legislation before us doesn't reflect that shift in the balance. The vaccine rollout, as we know, has been successful, and there were many in this House, time and time again, who questioned your ability, the ability of government, of the HSE to deliver. I wasn't one of those, because I genuinely believed that everybody would do their very best and that you were well competent to do so. And that means approximately 50% of the population are now vaccinated. I know that means 50% are not vaccinated, but those who are vaccinated are those who are most at risk of hospitalisation and dying because they have contracted COVID. So, despite the hugely disappointing news this morning regarding the Janssen vaccine, our rollout is still proceeding. And when you brought this legislation, this draft legislation, to the House, the target of 80% of the population receiving a first dose by the end of June, and I think it was around 55%, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not far out, excuse me, receiving a second dose, that was in place. But Minister, that's a totally different context to last January, when less than 10% had been vaccinated. And in that context, our response needs to reflect that. In fact, I agree with Deputy Richard Bruton when he says we should actually be looking at unwinding these powers instead of just simply rolling them over. Now, my colleague Michael McNamara will bring forward an amendment, because last March, Minister, we gave you, when this legislation was put in place, not last March, we gave you unprecedented power to bring in specific regulations, increasing restrictions. Now, we are rolling over the legislation to give you the power to do that again. And I believe that the specific regulations should come before the law. I think we have to be able to debate the specific regulation rather than just the legislation that enables you to do that. We have an oversight role here. People outside don't often see it maybe as that important until it affects their lives. But when it does, they realise just how important it is. And it's incumbent on us as TDs to ensure that that oversight is there and that you are held to account. So, in that context, I would also support the Sinn Féin amendment to bring the date back to the 9th of July. It's close, but what it does is it gives this House control, and that's crucial. And Minister, I've no doubt, if you were on the opposition benches and a minister was bringing in this kind of legislation which gives him or her unprecedented power to make these regulations, you would have concerns also. November 9th as an end date is not reasonable. It's far too far away. It's not proportionate, and it doesn't strike a proper balance between public health and civil liberties. Now, as I said, I can live with a constraint on civil liberties in the middle of a pandemic because we have to balance that with public health. But we are emerging from the pandemic, slowly, but we're emerging. So we're in a different space, and that requires a different approach. I think it's also important to say that this legislation amends social welfare acts. So if a person is diagnosed with COVID and they're sick, or if they have to self-isolate, then they have to continue to have an entitlement to illness benefit, and also in regard to job seekers benefit and job seekers allowance. And these need to be rolled over. So it presents us in the opposition with a horrible choice. Because we know these must be rolled over, but we have serious concerns about some of the other aspects of the legislation. And it's no choice at all, Minister, because people have to be protected, but to some extent, what we're doing here is we're protecting people from themselves when there is no need to do that anymore. And to me, that's a serious issue. So those protections around job seekers and illness benefit need to be rolled over, but the others need to be nuanced. And Minister, I think you can improve this legislation by taking some of the proposed amendments. I think they'll help to provide the necessary safeguards. I think the proportionate legislative framework for the current circumstances is what we would emerge with. And not just the current circumstances, but that for the near future. Can Corla, have I 10 or 20 minutes, can I ask, please? Okay. I've been flying, but I won't take it. That doesn't matter. Anyway, the other issue is the rolling sunset clauses. I mean, they're not acceptable now. Minister, I've listened to a good bit of this debate, but I didn't catch it all. And I think I might have heard somewhere that perhaps you're willing to amend that wording. I'm not sure, and I hope you are. But in truth, it tells us a great deal about the mindset of those drafting the legislation and those who approved the legislation, that they remained in the legislation, in the draft legislation. But I'll be listening carefully to hear what you have to say on that. Now, Minister, on a related note, and I suppose a very much related note, the announcements that we are expecting tomorrow. Can I please ask that we get simplicity and clarity around the guidelines? I have just argued for nuance in legislation, because that's where it's appropriate. But when it comes to guidelines, we need simplicity and clarity. And for example, Minister, when I hear of the possibility that we have different guidelines around tables that are 1 metre apart and tables that are 2 metre apart, to be honest, I lose the will to live. I understand where it comes from, the abundance of caution and trying to manage things. But Minister, what happens if somebody pushes their chair back a little bit? The 2 metres is now 1.7 metres. You know, are they breaking the law? Is the owner of the restaurant or the hotel breaking the law? Is somebody going to take out a measuring tape and measure the distance? I mean, this type of guideline is unenforceable. We all know that. and it brings the law into disrepute. And people who have followed guidelines to the letter, and, Minister, who want to follow guidelines to the letter, will start to ignore them. And if we make it simple and we make it clear, then it's much easier for people to follow. And I'm not making up this story. This actually happened today. I was speaking to somebody on the phone, just a general conversation, not a constituent, and they were talking to me about families not being able to dine together. And I said, hold on, they are. There's, you know, an allowance that if there's children and adults, it's a different number. Now, this person watches the news, reads the newspapers, but they actually were confused about it. And to be honest, unless we have very simple guidelines that everyone can understand, a lot of people will be in this situation. So, Minister, I'm not telling you or NEFIT or NIAC or anybody else what decisions to make, but I'm saying this: make your decisions. Tell us what the distance is, one distance. Tell us the numbers, not a series of numbers, and then let people get on with it. And, Minister, the possibility that there could be time limits on dining, let the owners of hotels and restaurants decide that. This is not something that should be decided centrally, and I just hope it won't be. And also, Minister, if hotels can open up, if they can open up their restaurants, then all restaurants should be able to open up. As I said, give us the rules, make them simple and straightforward, and then it's much easier to comply. One or two final points. The green card. I've heard, and please tell me I'm wrong, it was just on the grapevine, that while of course member states have flexibility about this, about when they introduce it and how they introduce it, etc., I have heard that there's a possibility that we may pick and choose. I mean, there are three things. If you have been vaccinated, if you have recovered from COVID, or if you have a negative test, then you should be able to access this green cert. I've heard rumours that we may pick and choose, and perhaps it's only those who are vaccinated who can access this cert. Minister, I think that would be devastating for the aviation industry. It's only speculation, and I hope it's not right, but yesterday I spoke of the importance of the aviation industry, of the importance of Shannon Airport, of the transatlantic connection to the whole West Coast. I'm from the Northwest Sligo, but I still recognise the value and the importance of that service. And our aviation industry is on its knees. So when we introduce the green cert, Minister, make sure, please, I'm asking you, that it's in conformity as much as we can with our European neighbours. But please don't pick and choose as to one or the other. So, Minister, can I finally say that I believe, by and large, this government has done a reasonable job on COVID. I mean, it's a global pandemic. There's no rules. They weren't written beforehand. And even when it's over, those rules can still change, because you can't negotiate with the virus. So it's easy to be wise after the fact. And in my view, those who have to make the decisions beforehand have the really tough job, and they have to stand or fall on those decisions. And as I said, I think you know, you've done a reasonable job, the government have done a reasonable job in extraordinary circumstances and in completely unforeseen circumstances. But my final word is that in the context of today's legislation, what we're discussing here, the time frame is too long. We should be looking at unwinding rather than rolling over. And I hope that when we discuss this at committee stage, Minister, you will look at taking on board some of the amendments that are proposed, because I genuinely believe that they will improve this legislation, and I think that's what every one of us in this House wants to see. Thank you.